So now we're ready to move on to camera operations. And so I need everyone to wiggle their fingers to make sure they're all ready to go, because we're going to start moving the cameras. And if you're busy typing away on the computers, you're going to probably want to grab your cameras and start working with your cameras, because this is going to be a little bit of a test. First off, we went through a little bit of a setup at the beginning of class where we made sure the batteries were charged and our cameras were firing. We have memory cards in there and things like that. And so there's a little bit more full setup that you want to go through before you go shoot your best friend's wedding, or you go on vacation, or you take a really important job. First off is format the memory card. This clears off any extra data on that card that might cause a communication problem with your camera. So before any important job, format the memory card. But before you do that, make sure you've downloaded any important information off of that card. Next up, make sure the time and date is set properly for the time zone and time that you are in. This is going to be attributed to all your photos once you take them. There are programs where you can adjust for it later on, but it's better to have it right at the beginning. Attach the strap. Adjust that diopter knob to make sure it's clear for you to see through the viewfinder. Make sure that you have your camera set to the proper image quality, whether that's RAW, JPEG, combination of them. Personally, I like RAW because that way you're getting the best information possible. Go through this menu system. If we went through it too fast and you want to go through and adjust it, go through the playback, the shooting, the setup menu to make sure that the camera is adjusted to the way you like it to work. I would shoot some test photos and make sure that there's no major dust issues on the camera. It's not a big issue, but it's better to get this checked out before you embark on a serious project. So shoot a blank white wall at f/22 and zoom in and look around for big old black specks, which is what they will look like. So once you have done that, we are ready to embark on your test. So what I have done is I have looked the camera over and I've kind of come to my own determination of what I think the 10 most important features are. And so as I bring these up, kind of think where they are. The exposure mode. How do you change your shutter speed? How do you change your aperture? Your ISO settings. Exposure compensation. How would you change that? Where do you get to your metering? The white balance. Focusing. AF area mode. And finally, the drive mode. These are 10 modes that you're going to be using on a regular basis. So to start off with, let's do a simple setup of your camera. So follow along, folks. Here we go. Set it to P for program mode. That's the dial on the top. We'll set it to P. We don't have to worry about shutter speeds and apertures, but we do. In this case, we're going to set our cameras to ISO auto. Now this one is actually a little hard to get to. We have to go into the menu system and go over to the shooting menu, down to ISO sensitivity settings, and go down to auto ISO sensitivity and turn it on. This is going to be a little bit of a pain because we're going to have to come back and turn this off for everything else. I normally wouldn't put it there, but for the super simple mode, that's what we're doing. Exposure compensation, let's make sure that is at 0, and that shows up in the back of your camera on your information display, and here we can see the plus and minus sign, and right next to that is 0. Be forewarned that the box right next to it has a lightning bolt and plus minus, and that is your flash exposure. We're not concerned about that right now, just the plus minus. If it is incorrect, you have the plus minus button on the top. You can go in, press that button in, and turn your command wheel to change that setting. Next up, metering. Now these next several features are going to be located in the information screen on the back of the camera. So you can either hit the shutter release or the I button to get the screen activated. And here we're looking for metering, which is this little symbol right here. It does say metering up in the corner. You press OK, and you can select between matrix, center weighted, and spot, and we want matrix. So we are set there. The next setting we want is white balance, which is up a few steps from that here in the information display. White balance, we want it auto. This is where I have it now. There's lots of other settings, but we're going to leave it in auto. The focus mode, we need to set this to single focus, and this is the AF focus mode. So we have the option of AF-A, S, or C, and we want single focus. Right below that is your AF area mode, and we want auto area in here, which is the bottom of the three options. So make sure you're in the auto area mode and go to the bottom of the three options and select that one. And finally, the drive mode, we want it single. And this always throws people off because we've been working in the menu, but now it's the actual lever on the top of the camera that's really easy to get to. So up at S for single shot. And so if you had to give the camera to somebody else who didn't know about photography, or if you just wanted to go out and shoot basic pictures, there's pretty much nothing you can do to manipulate the camera at this point. You just go out and take pictures. So that's the super simple setup, but it's not one that I recommend for anyone who wants to take control of their camera. So let's take it up a notch and set the camera up the way an enthusiast, a photography enthusiast might set it up. So in this case, let's change your mode dial to aperture priority. So we'll turn the mode dial to A. And now we don't worry about shutter speed still, but we do need to be concerned about aperture. So just for kicks, let's set the aperture to f4 if you have it. Now in aperture priority, to change to f4, you simply turn the dial on the back of the camera. And you're changing the f number. And if you have f4, you can go all the way down to that. Go ahead and set f4. Once that is set, we're going to turn off that auto ISO, so we do need to dive back into the menu system. And luckily, it's the last place we were at, so it's pretty easy to get to. We're going to go into the shooting menu, ISO sensitivity settings, go to the right, auto ISO sensitivity, go to the right, turn it off and press OK. I would then come back to the information screen that we see here, press the information button, and go up to ISO and make sure that that is set at 100. Your choices will be between 100 and high 2. We want it at 100. The next setting is let's make sure the exposure compensation is set at 0, which is where it was in the last time around, so we probably don't need to check that too closely. The metering system is in matrix, same as we were before, but we can go through and double check because it is right there, metering, and it is indeed in matrix. White balance is going to be in auto. So let's go up to the WB for white balance, and it is still at auto, so that's good. For focus, we're going to have this in single focus. The focus mode, AFS, is what we want here. Now this is where we're going to make a little bit of a change. Last time we were in auto area. This time we want to change to single point. So right below the AFS is where we can go in and change it to single point autofocus. We are now locked in on one point, and we can choose where that point is. And finally, single drive, which is once again on the top of the camera, right there on single. All right, we're going to be doing this for a number of different setups so that you can get familiar with all the features, the important features of your camera. Now we're going to do it old school style, retro style. So if you're an old school shooter, you might like to shoot manual. So let's go into the manual mode, M for manual. Now we need to select shutter speeds and apertures. And so let's see if you can go to 125th of a second by turning the dial on the back of the camera to 1/125th. Do that myself. Now we need to change our aperture. Do you remember how to change the aperture? Change the aperture to f8. Remember, you have to press in on that plus minus button up at the top of the camera. F8, because there's a good old saying in photography that says, how do you take a great picture? F8 and be there. It's a good aperture for a lot of things. Next up, let's change the ISO to 400. We press the information button, navigate up to ISO, and adjust that to 400 and press OK when we're done. ISO is now at 400. We're not going to worry about exposure compensation for this one, but we're going to change to center weighted metering. So in the information display, we go down to the metering system, and we're going to move it down one notch to center weighted and press OK. White balance, we're going to leave it auto, which is where it was before. I'll just double check that it's there. It is indeed in auto, so we're good on that. Focus mode. Manual shooters like manual focus lenses. So let's switch it to manual focus by actually going to the lens and switching it from A to M. So now the lens is in manual focus, and we can turn the focusing ring on the lens to focus. We don't worry about AF area mode because we're manually focusing, but let's move the drive mode to continuous so we can take pictures as fast as our camera will allow. And if we listen to the camera, you can hear it's firing about 3.7 frames per second, I believe. All right, so now this is a test of the emergency camera operating system to see if you know where all the buttons are on your camera. So this is how no one would ever set their camera up, but just so that you're familiar with where everything is. Set your camera to shutter priority. Quick, move that mode dial. I want you to select a shutter speed of 1/2 of a second. So you got to move that dial all the way down to 1/2. That is a 1/2 second. We're not going to worry about the aperture on this one, but I do want you to bump your ISO all the way up to, what do I want? 1600. So let's get to ISO, enter that, and jump it up to 1600. Next up, we haven't played with our exposure compensation. Let's do that. Exposure compensation with the plus/minus button on the top of the camera, and we're going to go to +2. Don't worry about making all these changes. We're going to clean this up later on. And for the metering, we're going to go to spot metering on this. Went to the wrong place myself. Go into the metering. Down at the bottom is spot and hit OK. White balance. We haven't been changing this. Let's go change the white balance to flash. And that is going to have the symbol of the lightning bolt. Are people following along? Am I going too fast? Am I going too slow? Is somebody way ahead of me? I think you guys are doing pretty good so far. So for focus mode, let's change this back to auto. I can't get to it. It's grayed out. Why can't I get to it? Oh, that's right. My lens is in manual focus. You got to switch your lens back to autofocus. Then you can get back into the focus mode where you can then change it to AFA. And here's where I want you to change to 3D tracking, which is in the AF area mode. It's down the 4th option at the bottom. We're now in 3D autofocus mode. And let's change the shutter to the quiet mode so that it doesn't make as much noise. I can still hear it, but it's a little bit quieter. All right, let's do another test. Let's change things around again. All righty, for this test, I want you to start off with P for program. That's pretty easy. You don't have to worry about shutter speeds or apertures. Let's put your ISO at 200. Next up, let's go to a -3 on the exposure compensation. Ooh, we were at +2. This means we've got to move a lot in the other direction. -3. There we go. Next up, we're going to go to center weighted metering. We were there once before, but we're going to find it again. We are changing from spot to center weighted. And then we're going to change our focusing area, our white balance to shade. Go back into white balance. The shade is what looks like a little house with a shadow cast beside it. The focus mode is going to go to continuous. So go back to the AF mode and make sure it's AFC for continuous. The AF area mode, we're going to go to dynamic, which is the one bracket in the middle with the points to the top, the bottom, and the side. It's the second one down. It's called dynamic area AF. And then finally, let's put the self timer on the drive mode. And it would do a 10-second self timer, and I'm not going to take the time to do it. We're going to do one final test just so that your fingers and your eyes are familiar with where to look. So this final one, let's go to shutter priority. I want you to go all the way down to 4 seconds. You may get a warning. Subject is too bright. But that's okay. This is just a test. ISO to 800. Make sure exposure compensation is back at 0. Got to hit that +- button. And let's put the metering on spot, highly centered in the spot. And then we're going to take white balance to incandescent. This is the standard screw-in light bulb, also known as tungsten bulbs. Compact fluorescent bulbs also fit in this category. Focus mode. Let's go to manual. That means back on the lens. Flip it over to manual, right on the lens. Don't worry about the AF area mode, and let's change the drive mode to continuous. That's the lever on top. Okay, now that we have got your camera into a position in which I think it's probably impossible to take a decent photograph, we need to start resetting it back to the normal standards. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at some actual picture taking examples. So the first one is just a landscape shot. If you want to take a landscape picture, and what's kind of common about landscapes is that you will have something in the foreground, you'll have something in the background. You often have the opportunity to be working from a tripod, and it's often recommended that you work from a tripod doing this sort of thing. And there's nothing moving a lot in the photograph. So you're not really concerned about shutter speed, but you're very, very concerned about depth of field. So let's set the camera up for this scenario. Personally, I like setting the camera in manual. So go ahead and set the camera to manual because you're going to have a few minutes to get the shot in, most likely. The shutter speed will be whatever it needs to be. You're on a tripod, it won't matter. But if we want lots of depth of field, let's set f16. And so you have to press in on the plus minus button and go ahead and set f16. That gives us good depth of field. Our ISO, I want to have the best quality images possible, so I'm going to set my ISO at 100. So make sure it gets back down to 100. We're not going to need our exposure compensation because we're in manual. So we move on to the metering mode. Let's change our metering mode to matrix, which is a good general purpose mode that I'm going to recommend for most all the things that we're going to be looking at. For white balance, let's make sure that is back at auto. I'm shooting in RAW, so I don't need to worry about it. If you are in JPEG, you might need to set that for daylight or cloudy or whatever the situation is. For focusing, I like to be pretty particular about where I'm going to focus, and so I will choose the single shot. It's grayed out in my camera because in the last setting, we turned the autofocus off on the lens. So make sure the lens is in autofocus, and then we can go to AF and select the AFS for single servo autofocus. As far as the mode, the area that I would want you to go to is single point focusing, which is the top selection in the AF area mode. And finally, the drive mode at single should do just fine. So all the way up at the top at single, and that's a good landscape mode. So moving on to a portrait mode. So when we talk about shooting a portrait, we're generally shooting portraits of people, but we could shoot portraits of animals. What's common here is that you want the subject's face, in particular the eyes, in focus. So that's going to be the area that you're most likely going to focus on. So you need to be very careful about focusing. You need to be concerned about subject movement, both your subject moving as well as yourself moving. So you're going to have to choose a shutter speed that's fast enough that you don't show that movement, unless you want that, of course. And here, because the subjects are likely to be moving around slightly from point to point, most people don't shoot these from a tripod. They're going to be shooting them handheld, so you have to be careful about having a fast enough shutter speed to handhold the camera. And so if I'm shooting a portrait of somebody, I'm usually asking them if I can shoot a portrait, and they're giving me a couple of minutes, maybe just 1 minute, but sometimes more than that to set up. So I'm more than happy to set the camera in manual and get everything exactly as I want it to. I'll want a reasonably fast shutter speed. Let's go to 125th, as that would be a good starting point. And for an aperture, I want to shoot with as shallow depth of field as possible. Now, the lens that I'm using right now doesn't go down to f4, so I'm going to go as wide as I can get on this lens, a lowest f number possible, and that on this lens is 3.5. So if you got 1.4, use it. If you don't, just do the best you can. For the ISO, like the landscape, I want it to be as high quality as possible, so I'm going to leave it at ISO 100 for this. I'll worry about exposure compensation if I need it. For metering, I'm going to leave it at matrix. I will double check to see that I'm there. I am indeed at matrix, so I'm going to leave that there. White balance, I'm going to leave it auto. If you're shooting RAW, you don't need to worry about this. For focus, this is what's kind of important. I would be in the single mode so that you could be very selective so you can lock your focus in on your subject's eyes. And I would be in the single point mode, which is just below the AFS, the AF area mode, single point autofocus. This is exactly where we were for landscape, so this part actually hasn't changed. And finally, on the drive mode, I prefer to have the camera in continuous. People's facial expressions and their gestures change very quickly, and this allows you to kind of shoot through a burst of images when everything is just to your liking. And so that's how I would set up the camera for a portrait mode. Next up, let's do a blur photo. Why would we want to take a blurry photo? There's nothing worse than a blurry photo, right? There's plenty of good blurry photos. There's good blur and there's bad blur. We're looking at good blur. So whether it's a waterfall showing the water movement or the dogs running and you have it blurring their feet, this is how I would set this type of shot up. First off, I like setting it in manual because I like to have direct control over those shutter speeds and apertures. You're going to need a slower shutter speed. This is what's kind of key. Now what that magic shutter speed is, I don't know, but a 1/15 of a second is a good place to start. You may need something a little faster, a little slower. It depends on the movement that you're photographing. The aperture really doesn't matter too much, but you're likely to be somewhere in the f11 range, so why don't you go ahead and set that on your cameras for practice. For the ISO, it can definitely be at 100 for most of these situations. No reason to bump that up. I will check to see that I'm at 100. I am indeed, so I will leave it there. For metering and white balance, these are going to remain the same for a lot of these. I'll be choosing matrix metering and auto white balance, which is where I was set before, so I'm not going to worry about that. For focusing, I prefer to manual focus on these, and so we're going to switch the lens back over to manual focus. If it's the waterfall, I might do a live view, magnify in, adjust manual focus on the rocks of the water so that it's perfectly sharp so that I know that I am perfectly sharp on that. If it's the dog race that I'm trying to blur, I would focus perhaps on the ground where they're going to be running, the path that they're going to be running on, and then I'm going to be doing a panning motion. I'm going to have enough depth of field at f11 so that focus isn't critical, but this way I can be sure that the lens isn't inadvertently going to the foreground or background. We don't need to worry about the AF area mode, and for the drive mode, for the waterfall, I'd put it in single, but for other types of panning action, I would put it in continuous so that you can get several shots and several opportunities at getting a nice blur shot. All right, so kind of the opposite of the blur shot is the action shot. And here's where you are photographing something, someone, some group of people that are moving towards you, away from you, and your camera needs to track their focus. So the important things here is a fast enough shutter speed to stop their movement and a focusing system designed to lock on and follow their movement. Most action that I have found usually takes place in a predictable area, and so I like using manual focus to figure out the right shutter speed and aperture and have it set. So for action shots, you're probably going to need something pretty fast, like a 500th of a second. So go ahead and set that on your camera. As far as an aperture goes, you're probably going to need a fairly wide aperture to shoot sports. A lot of sports photographers like lenses that go down to 2.8. This lens doesn't go down to 2.8, but I will do the best that I can, which is 3.5, which is just a half stop away, so I'm pretty close. For the ISO, this is where you may need to bump this up a little bit higher, and in this case, you might want to bump it up from 100 to 400. You may need to go beyond this. You may not need to go to 400. It kind of varies, but this is a good starting point for shooting action. Our metering will be at matrix. Our white balance will be at auto. That's the same. The focus is really important here. This is where we need to change to continuous. Once again, it's grayed out on my camera because my lens is in manual focus from our last little setup. So I switch my lens back to autofocus, and I go into the focus mode and change it to AFC for continuous. We can now see that the continuous is set. Now this is where we also want to make some changes in the area where we are focusing. And so we're going to go in here and we're going to change to the dynamic area. This is my favorite for sports motion. You get to choose the starting point, the bracket. It can be left, top, right, bottom, middle, and then it will follow that movement through the nearby brackets. So let's set the dynamic area focus. And then finally, for the drive mode, of course, we're going to set this to the continuous mode, which is actually where it has been for the last setting, so that I can shoot a series of shots, a burst of shots, very quickly. All right, here's one more setting. This is called maximum sharpness, and this is where there's no great need for depth of field. There's no great need for a particular shutter speed to stop any motion, but you just want to get the sharpest picture possible. You're going to want to work from a tripod in this case. You'll have time to work, so I would set it up in the manual mode. The shutter speed doesn't matter because you're on a tripod, camera movement, subject movement, non-existent, so you don't need to worry about it. A good aperture is an aperture in the middle of your range. And so f11 is going to be a good aperture to shoot at for a lot of people because it's kind of in the middle of the range. It depends a little bit on which lens you have. ISO will be at 100. Got to get that changed back down there from our sports mode, from 400 back down to 100. And then for metering, we're going to keep that at matrix. For white balance, we'll keep that at auto. Focusing mode. Single point, but you want to be very precise about what you are focusing on. So AFS for single. AF area, this is where you want to go back to single point focusing so that you have one pinpoint area you can decide where you want in focus. And for the drive mode, this is where I'd recommend using the self-timer. You could set the 2-second if you want, or you could just do the 10-second. Either way, that way your hands are not on the camera when you're actually firing the shutter. So now that we've got your camera all mixed up in these different modes, let's just get it reset back to basic photography. And so if I'm throwing the camera over my shoulder, I'm going to be walking around the streets and I don't know what I'm going to be photographing, here's what I would do to set my camera up. Yes, I'm actually going to a somewhat automatic mode here. Aperture priority. Let the camera figure out a few things for me. I'm just going to do aperture priority. And for an aperture, I'm going to start reasonably wide open. So in this case, I'm going to start at f4. And if I need more depth of field, I'll make that change at that time. But for now, I have a reasonably fast shutter speed to start with. I'm going to want to leave my ISO at 100. Let me double check that I am there. I am indeed at ISO 100. I will bump that up when and where necessary. Matrix for metering and auto for white balance, that hasn't changed. For focus points, for just general purpose, I like the single point, so that I can focus on one thing and it locks in and then I can recompose if necessary. I will change it to continuous when I go to moving action. I will use the spot area in the middle, and so the single point focus. And for the drive mode, I will generally just leave it in the single mode. And so there you are ready to go out and start snapping away. So that's the section called camera operation. And hopefully by now you have a really good feel for where all the important controls are on the camera and the type of changes that you're likely to make out in the field. It seems like anytime you come across a new situation, there's usually 2 or 3 things that you're going to have to change to set the camera up to get the best picture possible from that setting. So we're going to see if there's any questions or comments about that section before we end it with our lenses and accessories.
John, does the D3100 have exposure bracketing?
The D3100 does not have exposure bracketing.
Okay.
So that is something that you would have to do manually. And you could do very easy. You could set your camera up in program, take one picture, and then do a +1 and then a -1 using the exposure compensation.
And kind of building on that, Paula in Ohio had said, does Nikon use different term for high dynamic range? I thought my camera had it, but not finding where to set it. She has a D5000, so maybe you could explain that again.
Yeah,
HDR.
I don't know the D5000 inside and out, so there may be some different things. But HDR stands for high dynamic range, and it's a technique where photographers take multiple pictures at various exposure levels, bright, middle, dark, sometimes 5, 7, 9 pictures, and they combine them into one picture. That is not something that this camera or the 5000 does on its own in there. The active D-lighting is kind of doing some of that. It's trying to hold back certain highlight information and lighten up the shadows. but I certainly wouldn't say it's enough to throw it into HDR photography. That would be something that you need to do a little bit more manually and then manipulate in a program like Photomatics, I believe.
Great, thanks.
Sure thing.
Hendo had asked, what's the limitations on this camera with wireless flash?
Wireless flash, it really doesn't have any capabilities as far as working. Nikon has a very sophisticated wireless flash system where some cameras will tell other flashes how much power to put out and can communicate with multiple flashes in multiple groups working together or individually in a very sophisticated system. And this camera does not have that commander capability. It's rather limited to what can be done through the TTL flash. There are some external accessories available from companies like Pocket Wizard, but not something I want to get into at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Question from Sparks was, and he or she said maybe for later, but do you find the GPS feature on this camera useful at all?
I haven't had a chance to put the GPS feature to use in the field. I like the concept of it, but I haven't had a chance to use it yet.
IB Nathan had said that, is the fact that this camera is lacking a port for mic that important? And would it be very difficult to shoot audio with another mic and then sync audio with video? It's just a question of time.
Right. Well, this does have a built-in microphone. It's not great. If you just want simple little video, it's fine. One of the things this lacks is it doesn't have a mic input on it. And so if you wanted to shoot this to film your next Hollywood production, if that's the case, here's what you need to do. You can record the video with this, but then I would buy an external device for recording audio. And then you would probably want some sort of syncing device so that you can sync this stuff up later in whatever program you're using to assemble it later. And so it's a bit difficult to work with. Either you keep it very simple or it gets very complicated very easily. Higher end cameras will have ports that you can plug in stereo microphones for.
And another question from IB Nathan, does the infrared remote control work with the D3100?
I will be covering that in the lenses and accessories section.
There's a slide for that.
There's a slide for that.
Bora had asked for blurring images, why not spot metering?
Spot metering is a tool that could be used for any of the modes. It is just a personal style option, you might say. It could be used. The problem with the running dog is that it's a little hard to keep track of where that spot is reading at that very moment that you're firing the shutter. The spot metering is a tool that you need to be very, very careful with. It's a very powerful tool, something you don't want to accidentally leave on in your camera because it measures such a small area. If you have it thrown onto an especially light or especially dark area, it'll throw off your exposures tremendously. And so for beginners, I would say to kind of tend not to worry about spot metering. I would look more at taking an image that you have taken, and wow, this is a terrible image, but I'm going to use it anyway, and looking at the histogram. And if you don't know about a histogram, there's a great class called Fundamentals in Digital Photography. I recommend you look at it from Creative Live because I go through a full explanation. And I don't use the spot meter anymore because I have a histogram to show me my results, and I don't need the spot meter.
Okay, there was another clarification question from Croce. My main subject is my infant who moves a lot. Would I use focus mode AFC, continuous?
If the kids are moving a lot, the continuous mode would be good. And the question that I don't know that they didn't ask is, let me go ahead and set this up on the camera. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to change to AFC mode for continuous. And then on what area I'm going to choose, dynamic might work pretty well. Auto area might work pretty well, and 3D might work pretty well. It depends on the style of movement, the age, and the way they're running and forward. I have not had a great chance to really experiment with the 3D mode. It's a new mode where it's using additional information besides contrast. It's also using color and luminance, and that may be a very good mode for an erratic moving infant.
As they can be.
Sometimes.
I have another question, and I know we talk about this a lot with the white balance, but someone had asked why you wouldn't adjust white balance in the computer with computer software. Is it better to adjust in camera, and does it work on RAW also?
Right. It's a complicated issue, and it's frustrating, and that's why I shoot RAW. If you shoot RAW, you get the original data information, and you can adjust things later on in the computer with no damaging effect to the final picture. When you are shooting JPEGs and you have selected, let's just go and choose incandescent light, your camera is collecting all the data information, and then it says this picture needs to be tweaked in color to accommodate for incandescent light. And then it's all processed and compressed using that information. If you then realize that you had made a mistake, you shot JPEG, you put it in incandescent, and you went outside and you took a picture, it's going to be the wrong process information for that image, and it's not going to look right. And you're going to go into Photoshop and you're going to start playing with the color sliders, and you're going to find that you can't quite get it right. And even if you do get it pretty close, while you're doing this, you're damaging the photograph, which is something photographers don't like doing, damaging their photographs. And so that's why you either need to shoot RAW or you need to set it right before you shoot it. And so my preference is to shoot RAW, leave it in auto, and worry about it later if it doesn't happen to be right, because the auto works pretty good. And so even if you are shooting JPEG and it is in auto, chances are most of the time it's going to be right. But this is a good reason to keep look at the images that you're getting on the back of the monitor, and if there is a major problem, go into the white balance and make that change.
Ardo wanted to know what the color grid is that is given in white balance.
The color grid, something we're going to kind of shortchange you on here. We're not going into every detail, but there is a way to kind of customize the white balance. If you find that the incandescent setting isn't quite to the incandescent lights that you have in your house, you could adjust that a little bit. And so take a look in the instruction manual to find out more information about that.